Hey, seventh graders, shout out to second hour A Day as they've been getting everything done and are working pretty hard. So I appreciate it. You guys keep up the hard work. Today we're moving on. We're going to be talking about challenge to slavery. Last class, last lecture, we learned about our nation dividing. How the Kansas-Nebraska Act was basically a big bunch of gasoline or spark that fell on the gasoline of slavery, caused everything to explode. We also learned a little bit about John Brown, who we're going to go more in depth on today. Uh, Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. So today we're going to move on from the things that were dividing our nation to the point where people started challenging slavery. They challenged it a couple of different ways. They challenged it legally in court, and they're going to try to challenge it through violence. That's where the John Brown is going to come back into play. We're also going to learn about Stephen Douglas, get a little more insight into him, and new guy is going to be on the scene. This new guy on the scene is going to be Abraham Lincoln. So our key questions today. Question 1, what was the main issue addressed in the Dred Scott decision? This is going to be the legal challenge to slavery we're going to learn about. Question 2, what were the differences between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas's views on slavery? This is going to come up in the Illinois Senate election of 1858. Question 3, what were the reasons for John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry? And then question 4 is going to be, how did the North and South differ on their view of the events of Harper's Ferry? So those are our key questions today. Make sure we get those wrote down in our notebook. Everybody should be on page 18 for this. So, first thing we're going to look at is the legal challenge to slavery. And this happened in what's called the Dred Scott decision. Okay, the Dred Scott decision was pretty simply put a challenge to slavery in our Supreme Court. All right. You guys are seventh graders. We learned about really the Supreme Court in eighth grade, but to put it simply, the Supreme Court is the highest court in our country. There's nobody that can make a decision above the Supreme Court. The thing about the Supreme Court, once they make a decision, it's final, as well as it's law. It becomes part of our Constitution. So Dred Scott, a little background on him. Dred Scott was an enslaved person. Get my picture out of the way for you. That's him right there. So he was an enslaved person from Missouri. He was owned by an army doctor. The army doctor traveled around with him to different bases or forts, and some of those forts were located on free soil. So what Dred Scott did was he sued for his freedom. Okay, the reason he sued for his freedom was to basically because he was on free soil. So his argument was, you know what? I was a slave. He took me onto free soil. The minute I hit free soil, I should have been freed. Okay, so he sues the state of Missouri for his freedom. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court decision, which is considered as one of the worst decisions in the history of the court, the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, ruled that Scott had no right to sue in federal court. His reason for this was that African Americans were not considered citizens, which is a harsh ruling. Okay? Because as we all know, everybody's a citizen that's born here. Okay? It doesn't matter your skin color or anything like that. You have your rights. You're protected by the Constitution. But by this, basically, it eliminates any type of rights for African Americans. He further went on to say that slaves were property. And because they were property, their owners had more rights than they did. Okay? It's kind of like you owning a horse or a dog. They're your property. Okay? So they can't sue in federal court. And it's the same idea behind that. And that's how slaves were treated back then. Okay? So rather than protect the people that were slaves, the court protected the owners because the slaves were their property. And there had protections under the law. So what this meant was Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in any territory, and the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So it was against the law because it illegally seized people's property if you banned slavery. And just to sum it up again, the court ruling, Scott was basically not a citizen. He had no right to sue. He was property. The government cannot seize people's property without a reason. And Congress could not prohibit slavery because it illegally seized people's property. Northerners were shocked and outraged by this decision because it treated people with basically less human rights than your pencil, okay? Because your pencil is your property. People can't take your pencil. It's the same idea. Southerners rejoiced at this law because they felt it affirmed that slavery was a valid institution and it was now completely legal in the United States because of this. So the Dred Scott decision basically made slavery legal in the country. So that's the key thing to take away from it. A horrible decision by the Supreme Court, and it's really a stain on their legacy. Now we're going to move on to 1858. This is where Abraham Lincoln is going to come on the scene. Background on him, basically Abraham Lincoln was a jack of all trades back in the day. He started out working on a riverboat, basically poling riverboats down the river to New Orleans and coming back. He taught himself law, so he's a practicing lawyer. He was in the state government for a while, but this was his first federal or national election that he was going to take part in. And what he did, he challenged Stephen Douglas and Stephen Douglas' Senate seat. The reason he did this was because he hated the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Felt it was one of the worst things the country had ever done. Okay, this is a picture from one of their debates that somebody created. This is a photograph of Stephen Douglas over here, and this is an early photograph of Abraham Lincoln when he was running for Senate. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of debates that took place in the Illinois Senate race in 1858. Okay, and this pitted Lincoln against Douglas, and a new political party came about during this time too that Lincoln joined. That was called the Republican Party. It's the same Republican Party that's around today. Okay, Lincoln was opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Because he was opposed to that, he decided he would run against Stephen Douglas, who authored that act. So, and Lincoln was opposed to it because he didn't feel that slavery should be allowed to spread. The goal of his new party, or the Republican Party, which Lincoln was a member, was to stop the spread of slavery in the Western territories. That was their whole purpose. And that was one of the reasons that Lincoln was running for office. And you get their views during this time. And as we already learned, basically Stephen Douglas's view was popular sovereignty. Each state has the right to choose slavery if it pleases. That was his whole platform, and that's what he stood on. Douglas was really kind of prepping at this point to become president, and he was going to become senator and then later on move to become president. Lincoln, everybody got to find out his views on stuff, and Lincoln was a pretty good speaker, pretty sharp-witted man. His stand on African Americans, a lot of people think that he felt that African Americans deserved the same rights as everybody else. That wasn't actually the case. He did not feel that African Americans at the time were socially or politically equal to white people. So he didn't think they should have the right to vote, things of that nature. He did feel that African Americans were entitled to rights that were listed in the Declaration of Independence. Those would be life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Okay, so he felt that everybody was entitled to those rights. His view on slavery. He felt that slavery was morally wrong. Okay, it went against a person's soul. Slavery did. That's what he felt. He also felt that it would die out on its own. Okay, lots of Republicans at the time, Lincoln included, felt that slavery was like a fire. Okay, if any of you guys have ever seen a fire, excuse me, fire, if you contain it, it's going to stay in one spot and eventually die out, kind of like a fire pit. Okay, but if you don't contain that fire, it's going to spread and burn everywhere. And that's the same idea with slavery. Okay, if slavery is allowed to continue and expand, it's going to consume the whole country. So Lincoln was fine with slavery as long as it stayed in the South. And he was adamant that slavery could not be allowed in the West. Sorry, I had to get a little drink there. His position on the Union. The Union was another name for the United States. Lincoln was in favor of the Union. He felt that we had to remain united as a country. He has a famous statement, basically, a house divided cannot stand. We'll get more into that in class tomorrow. But he felt the Union could not survive half free and half slave. He said basically it's either got to be a free country or a slave country. If this half and half stuff won't work anymore. And it kind of makes sense if you think about a house. If you cut a house in half, is it going to fall down or is it going to stand up? Pretty simple analogy, and he had a way of doing that for people. He basically made things easy to explain. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates finished up, and Lincoln lost. But the important thing to remember about this, even though Lincoln lost the election, he still gained notoriety. He became popular in the American political circle. Moving on, finish up John Brown. Okay, John Brown back. He's back. Guess who's back? So John Brown shows up again. Okay, and this time he's going to show up in Virginia. So we're going to talk about his raid. A raid is where you basically go somewhere and attack it. So John Brown, little background on him again. Basically abolitionist driven out of Kansas for killing pro-slavery supporters. So basically, if you remember, he showed up in Kansas during Bleeding Kansas, killed a bunch of pro-slavery supporters, and then split. And now he's going to pop back up again in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His plan kicked off in 1859, and his whole idea was that he was going to seize guns at Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry was our federal arsenal. An arsenal is a place where our government keeps all their weapons. So his plan was to basically seize the federal arsenal, take all the weapons, give them to the slaves, and then he was going to be their leader in a revolt to free them all. Okay, pretty good plan, except he's basically attacking the federal government. Okay, now Brown's plan doesn't succeed, even though he gets support from northern abolitionists, and many abolitionists see him as a hero. Basically, the U.S. government sends the United States Marines to Harpers Ferry. They squash his raid and basically capture him, kill his sons, and things aren't going to go well for John Brown from here because he basically attacked the United States. But Southerners were worried because he was being supported by the northern abolitionists, and lots of them saw him as a hero in the North. His raid failed. Marines, led by Robert E. Lee, who, remember that name because he's going to be important in the Civil War, captured John Brown. He was tried and he was executed for his crimes against the country. Because of this, Brown became a martyr. A martyr is somebody that dies for a great cause, and that's John Brown. So to sum everything up, what we learned about today, Dred Scott decision, we tried to challenge the legality of slavery in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court basically had a horrible ruling against slavery, or for slavery, basically against treating African Americans and slaves as equal citizens. We learned about Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. We got Lincoln's views on slavery, on African Americans, and on the country. We learned that he lost that election, really the only election that he's going to win on a national level is to become president. And we learned about John Brown again. Now, tomorrow in class, we'll talk about all this. You guys will do some caricatures of Lincoln and Douglas, and then we'll actually do what's called a QAR, question-answer relationship about all this. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. You guys have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.